In the winter of 1887, Elkhorn Creek, a quiet, God-fearing community nestled in the backwoods of Franklin County, Kentucky, saw its polished veneer begin to crack. The townspeople, many of whom had known each other for generations, started speaking in hushed tones about noises that didn't belong in their peaceful surroundings. Long after the sun had dipped below the rolling hills and the last of the oil lamps had been snuffed out, unearthly screams would drift across the frost-covered fields. They came not from the forests nor from passing trains, but from a large estate that sat alone at the edge of town, the Navarro property. The house itself stood like a monument to Southern wealth, built of pale brick and crowned with two proud chimneys. It was elegant, the kind of place people expected to see in Lexington or Louisville, not tucked away in a quiet bend of Kentucky farmland. Locals had once admired it. Children would stop and stare at its black wrought-iron gates, wondering what kind of person lived in such grandeur. That person was Camila Navarro. She had arrived in Elkhorn Creek, a widow, dressed head to toe in somber black, with a voice as soft as lace and a gaze that could silence even the most arrogant man. People said she came from old Virginia money, that her late husband had died under tragic circumstances during a hunting trip, and that Camila had inherited everything. Whatever the truth, she wasted no time building her reputation. She donated generously to the First Methodist Church, sat front pew every Sunday, and began a small domestic training program for young women from rural counties, offering them room, board, and work in town homes and farms. To most, she was the model of Christian charity. To the desperate, she was salvation. Camila Navarro was 43 when the whispers began. Tall and sharply elegant, she moved like someone born to command attention. Her dresses were always pressed, her black hair braided and pinned never moved out of place. She rarely smiled, but when she did, it carried a weight that froze conversations in mid-air. She had the kind of presence that made people believe in her righteousness. Without question, what no one saw was what went on behind her front door. Camila's house was large enough to house several young women at a time, girls who came from the hollers and river towns of Kentucky in search of honest work. Most were no older than 16. Poor, isolated, uneducated, they arrived with threadbare bags and hopeful eyes, having been sent by families who could no longer afford to feed them. Their names would appear briefly in the church registry under training, then disappear as if they had never existed. No one thought to ask questions. Not back then. Inside the house, Camila maintained strict order. The girls were told they'd be trained for domestic life, how to set a table, polish silver, launder clothing with care. And for the first few weeks, that's exactly what it looked like. The routines were structured but fair. Meals were small but regular. They had chores and bedtimes and prayers before lights out. It all seemed normal. Structured, yes. But normal. What they didn't know was that Camila had no intention of placing them in homes. The training program was merely a facade, a well-crafted story told to neighbors and clergy to justify the steady stream of girls who entered but never returned. Camila Navarro was not a socialite. She was not a widow in mourning. She was not a woman of faith. She was a predator. What she had built on the edge of Elkhorn Creek wasn't a house. It was a chamber, a place where cruelty could flourish under the mask of order and grace. She had discovered early on that no one would question a woman of her stature. Her pristine reputation was a fortress, and behind its walls she could explore urges that most could not fathom. Urges that had been with her since childhood, carefully suppressed, now given free rein. Her victims were handpicked, chosen for their vulnerability, their loneliness, their eagerness to please. The first few, she measured how far she could go without leaving marks. Emotional punishments disguised as moral instruction. Public shaming in front of the other girls. Denied meals. Endless cleaning. Then, slowly, her methods evolved. One girl, a 16-year-old named Lila Mae from Breathitt County, arrived in January. Her parents had perished in a flood, and a traveling preacher had arranged her placement. She was strong-willed, Camila noted, but naive. During her first days, Lila thanked Camila at every turn, sighed she felt blessed to be there. Camila studied her with the cold calculation of a scientist observing a caged bird. She documented her reactions to harsh words, to cold rooms, to fatigue. She kept a small notebook where she tracked behaviors like a farmer tracking weather patterns. It didn't take long for the discipline to turn violent. Camila would find fault in everything: imaginary specks of dust, the angle of a folded blanket, a misplaced prayer book. Lila was punished first by isolation, then by more severe means. Her meals were halved. Her work doubled. When she stumbled, she was slapped. When she wept, she was mocked. Over time, Lila's back straightened less. Her eyes lost their shine. And still, the others in the house said nothing. Perhaps they feared being next. Perhaps they were already broken. Camila believed she was doing God's work. She told herself this every night. In a hidden room beneath the cellar, one she referred to privately as her refinement chamber, Camila had created a space untouched by morality. Iron rings embedded in stone walls, hooks and chains, buckets and blades. She called it a place of repentance, a laboratory for the soul. By spring, Lila Mae was gone. The girls were told she'd been placed in a good home outside of Frankfurt. No one ever saw her again. Camila had buried her behind the orchard, where the earth stayed soft year-round. She marked the spot only in her notebook, never in soil. Over the next year, more girls came. More girls vanished. The rumors in town grew louder, but never quite loud enough. People were too polite, too hesitant to accuse a woman of the church. A widow who gave so generously. What they didn't know was that they were living alongside the first serial killers their state had ever known, and her work had only just begun. It was the morning of March 9th, 1887, when Margaret Whittaker arrived at the Navarro estate. The girl had walked for 3 days from the narrow valleys of Laurel Ridge, her shoes falling apart at the seams, her hands blistered from gripping the handle of a single canvas sack. She was only 15, and already the lines of hardship had settled around her eyes. Her mother had died of fever that past winter, and her father, crippled from a logging accident, could no longer provide for her. The town priest, a man too poor to help, but too kind to turn her away, had written a recommendation for a place that offered structure, learning, and Christian guidance. He meant the home of Camila Navarro. When the girl arrived, her cheeks red from cold and her breath visible in the early morning air, Camila opened the door herself. She was dressed impeccably, as always: black satin, lace at the throat, a silver brooch fixed with perfect symmetry. Her dark eyes scanned Margaret from head to toe, not with concern, but with assessment. A slight curve tugged at her lips, something that almost resembled a smile. But not quite. You've had a long journey, Camila said calmly, stepping aside to let her in. I expect you'll find this home to be more orderly than the one you've left behind. Margaret nodded with gratitude, her voice too parched to speak. Camila's hand brushed lightly against the small of her back as she guided her down the hall, past gilded mirrors and polished wainscoting, through a silence so dense it swallowed every footstep. The house smelled of lavender and old wood, but underneath that was something fainter, something colder. Margaret's new room was small, but neatly arranged. A narrow bed with iron bars, a dresser with no mirror, a single window facing the orchard, where the fog always seemed to hover. There was a wash basin and a crucifix, and folded linens at the foot of the bed. It looked simple. It looked safe, but Margaret wasn't the only girl in the house. There were 3 others at the time: Caroline, Ruth, and Elise, all slightly older, all wearing the same faded gray uniforms with white aprons. They moved through the house with mechanical precision, quiet, disciplined, purposeful. They kept their eyes lowered and never spoke unless spoken to. Margaret noticed bruises on Caroline's forearm when she helped carry linens down the stairs, but said nothing. Later, Ruth whispered while they were scrubbing the floor, "Do exactly what she says. Don't ask questions. Never go near the cellar door." At first, the days unfolded predictably. The girls woke before sunrise, recited prayers in the front parlor, and began chores that carried them through to dusk. Camila was always present, watching, correcting, evaluating. Margaret once dropped a spoon during breakfast and apologized. Camila didn't reply. Instead, she turned and walked away. At evening, Margaret's dinner was withheld. The next day, her laundry duties doubled. It became clear that Camila believed pain was a teacher, silence a virtue, and fear a foundation for discipline. But she never raised her voice, never struck them in view of others. Her cruelty was quiet, surgical, restrained. Her punishments were masked as lessons, and the house was her classroom. Over time, Margaret learned to speak less, move quickly, and pray longer. Camila began paying particular attention to her. She would call Margaret to her study under the pretense of correcting stitching or reciting scripture. But the questions were always personal. How long had she lived with her parents? Had she ever lied to them? Did she know what sin looked like in her own heart? Margaret would answer as best she could, but it was never enough. "You were raised with very little refinement," Camila said one evening, her voice as calm as candlelight. "But you are moldable. That is what matters." The punishments grew harsher after that. Longer hours on her knees scrubbing wooden steps, being made to stand facing a wall for entire evenings. One night, Camila placed a heavy book on Margaret's head and instructed her to walk the length of the hall without letting it fall. Each failure earned her more time without sleep. Camila told her it was preparation, training, salvation, and Margaret believed her. At least for a while, the cellar was always locked. The key was on a chain around Camila's neck, hidden beneath the high collar of her dresses. The door itself was thick oak, reinforced with iron latches. Once, late at night, Margaret thought. She heard something behind it, muffled sounds that rose and fell like breathing, or sobbing, or something worse. She told herself it was imagination. But at T. The next morning, Elise was gone. Camila told them she had been sent to a farm near Lexington. She was ready, she said simply. The training served her well. No one asked further. They had learned not to doubt Margaret, tried to hold on to a sense of faith in God, faith in the future, faith that she would one day leave that house and be whole again. But her faith began to fracture in small, silent ways. She no longer looked out the window. She stopped writing in the small journal she'd kept hidden in her sack. She ate slowly, chewed cautiously, flinched at sudden movements. When she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror, she barely recognized the pale, hollow-eyed girl who looked back. Camila, of course, saw all of this, and it pleased her. What fascinated Camila wasn't just the suffering. It was the transformation. She watched Margaret deteriorate with the eyes of a painter watching a masterpiece take form. Every tremble, every pause, every tear was a brushstroke on the canvas of control. She was fascinated by the fragility of spirit, the way obedience could be carved from resistance. In her journal locked in her writing, Camila began referring to Margaret as Subject 3. The others had been trials, she wrote. Margaret would be a model, a new kind of project, a girl whose descent she would record in full. She began charting her psychological decay the way a scientist might chart a fever tracking behaviors, thoughts, reactions, and patterns. She timed how long it took for Margaret to respond to praise, and how quickly fear returned when kindness was withdrawn. By the end of May, Margaret was sleeping only 4 hours a night. She no longer cried. She no longer prayed. And one evening, when Camila asked her whether she loved her, Margaret whispered, "Yes." It was the answer. Camila had been waiting for in the basement beneath the house. She began preparing a second chamber. By early summer of 1887, the house on the outskirts of Elkhorn Creek no longer felt like a training center. It had become something colder, heavier, an institution where silence ruled more than any spoken command. The air inside grew thick with tension, and the girls moved as though each floorboard beneath them could give way. Even breathing seemed dangerous. Camila Navarro, once seen by the community as a woman of grace and charity, was inside orchestrating a quiet nightmare that no one on the outside dared to imagine. Margaret, now several months into her stay, had changed. The once curious girl from Laurel Ridge who arrived with calloused hands and sunburned cheeks now kept her eyes low and her mouth shut. Her skin was paler, her wrists thinner, her back permanently stiff from hours of punishment disguised as posture training. Her spirit had not shattered completely, but it had cracked in so many places that it no longer held her upright in the way it once had. Ruth and Carolyn, the other girls still in the house, had their own scars, both visible and hidden. They rarely spoke to one another anymore. Camila had made sure of that. Any whisper was a sign of disobedience, any moment of solidarity a threat to her order. She had learned early on that it wasn't enough to punish rebellion. She had to extinguish connection. The girls now slept in separate rooms. They ate in silence. They bathed at staggered times. The few remaining routines were meticulously timed and overseen. Camila often stood in doorways, watching without comment. When she did speak, it was always in the tone of a teacher correcting a child, measured, soft, and unforgiving. Camila had begun referring to each girl by number in her notes. Margaret was subject 3. Carolyn was subject 4. Ruth, subject 5. She believed names gave the girls too much humanity. Numbers were easier to control, cleaner, more clinical. It made what she was doing feel less like cruelty and more like procedure. In the basement chamber, Camila had installed new restraints, crafted iron cuffs bolted to the walls, padded but firm. She claimed they were for discipline, a last resort, but they were always ready. A second room had also been prepared, smaller and windowless, designed not for punishment, but for observation. A place where Camila could watch and record without interruption. She began moving Margaret between the two rooms at unpredictable intervals, testing her reactions, her fear, her confusion. It wasn't about the pain anymore. It was about measuring the limits of the human mind. One evening, Margaret was kept in the main chamber for 12 hours. Camila didn't touch her. She didn't speak to her. She simply stood nearby with a notebook, watching. When Margaret finally broke down in tears, Camila made a note. Subject 3. Response to silence-induced isolation. 7 hours, 49 minutes. To Camila, this wasn't madness. It was progress. Outside the estate, summer bloomed around the countryside. Children fished in the streams. Church picnics filled the pastures. The people of Elkhorn Creek continued to see Camila as a patron of the community. Her donations to the church had increased, and she now sponsored 2 orphans at the local mission. Her appearances at town events were less frequent, but no one questioned it. Widowhood was a private burden, and everyone respected her space. But inside her home, the weight of secrecy grew unbearable for one person, Ruth. Ruth had always been the most fragile of the group. A quiet girl from McLean County, she'd come to Camila after her family's farmhouse was destroyed in a fire. She had been shy but obedient, eager to prove herself, and too traumatized by the past to question authority. But what she saw inside, the Navarro home began to wear away at her already thin trust in the world. She had seen Margaret carried down the hall one evening, unconscious. She had heard the sound soft at first, then unbearable. She had smelled burning fabric. She had once passed the basement stairs and noticed a thin line of blood trailing down the last step. Ruth began keeping her own small journal. She hid it behind a loose board beneath her bed and wrote in it only when she was sure Camila had gone to town. Her entries were clumsy, scared, and brief, but they were raw. July 10th. Margaret screamed again. She didn't stop this time. I feel sick. Caroline said nothing. I think we're not supposed to feel anything anymore. July 19th. Saw Camila cleaning the iron cuffs. She smiled, not at me, at herself. Her lips didn't move, but her eyes did. July 22nd. I don't think Margaret is sleeping. She looks like a ghost. I think she wants to disappear. Maybe I do too. Camila had no idea Ruth was writing. She still viewed her as weak, obedient, unimportant. That was her mistake. Ruth may not have been brave in the traditional sense, but her fear gave her clarity. She saw Camila for what she was, a predator, masked in piety. Meanwhile, Camila's son, Elijah Navarro, had returned to the estate. He had been gone for nearly a year, traveling between relatives in Tennessee and studying mechanical engineering in Nashville. Few knew much about him, and Camila rarely mentioned his name. But Elijah had been raised in that house. He had heard things, seen things. And when he returned that August, now 23, he noticed changes immediately. The house felt darker. The windows, though clean, let in less light. The air was heavier, and his mother, she was more rigid than ever. Her routines bordered on obsession. She was thinner, her hands often trembling in the morning, and her voice carried the dry echo of someone used to talking to herself more than others. Camila welcomed him back with warmth, at least on the surface. She claimed the training home was thriving, that her methods had become more refined, more effective. She said the girls respected her more than ever, but Elijah wasn't convinced. He saw the way the girls flinched when she entered a room. He noticed how they never looked at him directly. When he asked where Margaret was, Camila replied that she'd been sent to live with a pastor's family in Harrodsburg. When he asked about Elise, she said the same. Too many girls, too many disappearances, and the cellar door was always locked. Elijah didn't yet know what his mother was truly doing, but a storm had begun to gather in his thoughts. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. And for the first time in his life, he began to wonder if silence had become more dangerous than defiance. By the time Elijah Navarro had spent 2 full weeks back in the family home, his suspicions had begun to coil tightly around his thoughts, refusing to loosen even as he tried to distract himself with mechanical sketches and polite conversation. The house he had returned to was not the same house he had left. It wasn't just the coldness in the air or the stiffness in the furniture. It was the way the walls seemed to listen, the way every closed door seemed to hold back a secret that longed to be spoken. Camila watched him closely. She claimed it was motherly concern, the kind a widow should naturally feel for her only child, but her gaze lingered too long. Her questions were too specific. Had he been sleeping well? Had he noticed the girls were unusually quiet? Did he think the house had changed? He lied, told her everything felt familiar, said he was grateful to be home again, said he trusted her. She nodded with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Elijah had always known. His mother was intense discipline to a fault. As a boy, he'd watched her demand perfection from every servant, every guest, every moment of her day. But there had also been a strange tenderness in her once. a fragile kind of warmth that showed itself in rare gestures. A gentle pat on the shoulder, a tightly folded handkerchief left on his knitstand, her voice softening when she read scripture aloud in the evenings. But that softness had evaporated. What remained was something calculated, something precise. She spoke like a woman reciting memorized lines. Her hands were always busy, but never with anything ordinary. And most concerning of all, she never left the house anymore. Not unless it was to walk among the orchards, always alone, always after dark. One evening, as a storm pressed down over the hills of Franklin County and the wind screamed across the porch rails, Elijah heard the sound for the first time. It was faint at first, like the dragging of something across stone. Then came the muffled sobbing, broken and slow. It stopped, and began again, lower, rawer. The sound came from beneath him, from the cellar. He left his room and crept through the silent house. The girls were nowhere to be seen. The lamps were dim. A grandfather clock in the hall ticked slowly, and somewhere above, the storm struck the roof with a branch that had been torn free by wind. Elijah found the cellar door locked, just as it always had been. A thick iron bolt secured it in place. He pressed his ear to the wood. Nothing. Just the quiet breathing of an old house and the rumble of thunder. But he knew what he had heard. And once you hear something like that, something not meant for your ears, you can't simply forget it. It lives in your chest. It spreads. The next morning, he asked Ruth if she had heard anything strange during the storm. Her face went pale. She looked down and whispered, "We're not allowed to talk about the cellar." That was all she said. That same afternoon, while Camila was at prayer in her study, Elijah explored the house again. His memory served him well. Every corridor, every room, every floorboard that creaked more than the others. And eventually, in a forgotten drawer of an old writing desk in the attic, he found something unexpected. It was a photograph. A black and white portrait of a young girl in a plain dress, standing beside the orchard fence. The girl was not familiar. She looked around 16, maybe younger. On the back of the photo, written in Camila's unmistakable hand, were the words, "Elise, second success." Elijah sat with that photograph for a long time, his thumb tracing the ink, his pulse quickening. Second? How many were there? That night, unable to sleep, he went back to the door. The cellar. That door had been part of his childhood, the one place always forbidden, always off limits. It had once held old preserves, pickled jars, and rusted tools. But Camila had changed it, reinforced it, locked it. Now it felt like it breathed. Tried the handle. Still locked. But something in him stirred, something between dread and resolve. He knew he couldn't confront her directly. Not yet, so instead he waited. He watched Dot and Camila, sensing his growing distance, adjusted her strategy. She began inviting him to her prayer sessions. She insisted he join her in the parlor every evening, where she read from the book of Job or Ecclesiastes, choosing verses heavy with suffering and obedience. She spoke of cleansing, of moral clarity, of fire forging the soul into purity, and she spoke of sin, often, especially the kind of sin that grows inside those who question authority. "You know, Elijah," she said one night, her hands folded. Over her lap, her eyes not blinking, "Doubt is a form of rot. It begins small, barely noticeable, but if left unchecked, it can hollow out even the most faithful heart." He said nothing, just nodded and pretended to listen. What Camila didn't know was that Elijah had found Ruth's journal. It had been hidden poorly behind a loose board beneath her cot. He hadn't meant to invade her privacy, but when he had gone to check on her during one of her coughing fits, he had stumbled upon it. The pages were worn and smudged. Some entries were missing. But what remained was horrifying. Each line was a confession. Each sentence a window into the unseen world his mother had created. He read about Margaret, about the nights she didn't sleep, about Elise, about the sounds, the restraints, the punishments. One line burned into his mind. She smiles after Margaret cries. It's like the crying feeds her. Elijah didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he made a choice. He would enter the cellar. Whatever was down there, whatever truth had been buried beneath, years of locked doors and righteous appearances, he needed to see it. Because if he didn't, he would be complicit. Just another quiet man in a town that had learned to look away. That evening, when Camila announced she was heading into town to deliver a gift to the local preacher, Elijah knew this was his chance. The moment her carriage disappeared down the gravel road, he rushed to her room. Her jewelry box sat untouched, her wardrobe open. And there, on the dressing table, was the chain, the key. He took it and descended the stairs, each creak louder than the last. When he reached the cellar door, his hands shook. But he slid the key into the lock, turned it, and opened the door. Rush of cold air hit him. It smelled like rust and vinegar, and something deeper. The stairs groaned beneath him as he stepped into the dark. He lit a lantern from the wall hook and held it forward. What he saw was not a root cellar dot. It was a chamber dot stone. Walls, iron restraints, a small table covered in tools that didn't belong in a home, buckets, chains, and on the far wall scripture, hand-painted in perfect lettering. He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. Then he saw the blood, not old, not dried, not fresh. The moment Elijah Navarro stepped into the cellar, something ancient and wrong closed in around him. It wasn't just the chill in the air, or the stillness of the underground. It was the feeling. That pain had soaked into the stones. The walls seemed to hold memory. Grief clung to the ceiling like cobwebs. The lantern in his hand flickered as he stepped further in, and his breath turned visible with cold. The room was not large, but it had been designed with purpose. Iron shackles were fastened to the wall at shoulder height, their metal worn smooth by repetition. Beneath them, grooves in the floor suggested something had been dragged over and over in the same path. A long, low bench stood in the center of the space, and next to it, a table held an assortment of instruments no domestic servant would ever use. Hooks, clamps, lengths of twisted leather, and sharpened metal tools that bore no agricultural or culinary function. Everything was arranged with surgical precision. On one wall, a series of dates had been carved directly into the plaster. Underneath, each date were initials. Some had been crossed out. Others were circled. At the very bottom, beneath a date only 2 weeks old, he saw it. Margaret Whitaker. Elijah's legs nearly gave out. There was no longer any question. No excuse. No more space for hesitation or doubt. His mother had done this, built this room, maintained it, used it. Whatever she had become in the eyes of the town, in the pages of church records, in the whispers of neighbors, this was who she truly was. And now, the burden of knowing the truth sat squarely on his shoulders. He moved slowly around the room, the lantern casting harsh shadows. In the far corner, he found a small wooden chest. It was locked, but the hinges were old and brittle. With one swift kick, it broke open. Inside were folded linens stained with dark patches. Beneath them, a stack of books, journals, each one marked with a year. He opened the top one and saw his mother's handwriting. The entries were detailed. She had documented everything. Subject 1, failed early. Inconsistent obedience. Weak constitution. Subject 2, pain threshold lower than expected. Showed promise and discipline structure, but expired before final test. Subject 3, most promising. Behavioral shifts evident after fourth. Week of intensified routine. Displays signs of dependence. I believe full obedience is achievable. And below that Margaret's name. Not just her initials this time, but her full name. Underlined. Elijah's hands trembled as he flipped through more pages. The journal was not the diary of a woman unraveling. It was the work of someone who believed in what she was doing. A teacher, a scientist, a zealot. His mother had studied suffering, refined it, tested it like one tests fire, seeing how long something could survive before it turned to ashdod, and then, tucked between the pages, a letter. It was addressed to a preacher in Bowling Green, a request for a new girl. A recommendation had already been arranged. A name was written at the bottom. Clara Loudon, age 14. She was already preparing her next subject. Elijah backed away from the table. The air in the cellar felt tighter now, as though the walls themselves had taken a breath, and were waiting for him to act. He turned and left, locking the door behind him, tucking the key back beneath his coat. Upstairs, the house was still and empty. Camila had not yet returned. He knew what he had to do, but knowing did not make it easier. He could not go to the local sheriff, not without proof that extended beyond what he had seen. Not in a town where Camila Navarro's name carried weight. She had friends in every pew, handshakes with every merchant, ties to every respectable family within 30 miles. He needed someone who could look past her reputation, someone with nothing to lose. And then he remembered Reverend Claymore. Man had once served as interim pastor in Elkhorn Creek before returning to his hometown of Shelbyville. Unlike the others, he had never fawned over Camila's generosity. In fact, Elijah remembered clearly how the Reverend had once called Camila's interpretation of discipline concerning. At the time, it had caused a minor scandal in the parish, and Claymore had been asked to step down from his post. But Elijah had respected him, and now he needed him. The next morning, Elijah made preparations to leave. He packed the journals in a satchel, wrapped in cloth to protect them from rain and suspicion. He left before Camila returned from her mourning errands, telling Ruth only, "Stay inside. Don't ask questions. I'll be back." He rode for 2 days through storm-soaked roads, avoiding towns when he could, resting in barns and empty chapels. His mind returned again and again to the faces of the girls. Margaret, Elise, Ruth. How many had there been? How many had left home thinking they were walking into salvation, and instead entered a place designed to erase them? When Elijah finally reached Shelbyville, he found Claymore at the back of a small church, tending to a broken window. The old pastor was surprised to see him, but listened carefully as Elijah spoke, not just about what he had seen, but about what he feared would happen next. He didn't dramatize. He didn't speculate. He presented the journals, the photograph, the letter. And when he was finished, Reverend Claymore sat in silence for a long time. At last, he said, "I believe you, but this can't be handled quietly." Claymore contacted 2 trusted officials in Frankfurt, men not easily swayed by money or appearances. He promised Elijah that they would investigate, that they would act swiftly. But in the meantime, Elijah had to return home. Returning to the Navarro house was like stepping back into a fever dream. Camila was waiting for him in the parlor, her hands folded in her lap, her posture rigid. She asked nothing about where he had been. Instead, she offered tea, spoke of scripture, quoted Proverbs as though it were poetry. Elijah played along, nodded, sipped, and excused himself early. But that night, as he passed Ruth's door, he saw something that stopped him cold. Her bed was empty. Her window open. Her journal gone. And in the silence that followed, the first note of panic slipped into his heart. Was she running? Or had she been taken? The room was empty. Elijah stood at the threshold of Ruth's quarters, the night air drifting through the open window. Her blanket had been pulled back, the pillow flattened but untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no scuff marks, no blood. But the silence was more violent than any scream. The kind of silence that announces something has gone very, very wrong. He crossed the room slowly, eyes scanning every corner. Her journal was gone. The small lace kerchief she always tucked into her drawer was missing too. Her boots, the ones with the split sole, had vanished from beneath the bed. This wasn't a removal. This was a departure, or perhaps a disappearance. He checked the grounds. The orchard behind the house swayed in the moonlight, but no one moved among the trees. The path leading toward the creek was untouched. Camila's bedroom was dark. No lantern, no movement, no voice. The house had become a trap of uncertainty. By morning, Camila's tone had shifted. Over breakfast, she sat in her usual place at the head of the table, hands folded, voice low and sweet like syrup before it scalds. She said Ruth had been sent away, another successful placement. She claimed a family near Somerset needed help caring for their youngest children. A Christian household, hard-working folk. Ruth had left at first light, she said, eager to begin her new life. Elijah didn't believe her. Not for a second. Camila's eyes stayed on him as she spoke, watching for the flicker, waiting for doubt to betray him. But he gave her nothing. He just nodded and ate a piece of toast that tasted like sawdust. That afternoon, Camila hosted 2 women from the Elkhorn Creek Ladies' Charity Guild. They sat in the parlor sipping tea, complimenting her needlework, praising her continued generosity toward orphan girls. Camila smiled, shared stories, and even laughed, a warm, practiced sound that never reached her eyes. Behind them, the clock ticked steadily toward a truth none of them could hear. Elijah couldn't sit idle. Not anymore. He went back to the cellar that evening after Camila retired. His hands trembled as he unlocked the door, the key heavy in his palm. He lit a lantern and descended the stone steps, bracing himself for what he might find out. It was worse than before. The main chamber hadn't changed. The iron shackles, the bench, the table of instruments, all exactly where he had last seen them. But now, the second room once locked was open. A narrow passage had been cleared. He stepped inside and found what had once been a root cellar, now transformed into a second space for confinement. The walls had been padded with cloth, as if to muffle sound. A single chair stood in the center, fastened to the floor with thick chains. But what shattered him most was the wall of drawings dot-taped and pinned. Dozens of sheets hung crookedly, many scrawled with childlike pencil marks. Figures bent over, eyes scratched out, small girls kneeling. One drawing showed a woman with a key around her neck and a halo drawn in charcoal above her head. A perverse saint. A monster disguised as Savior. Ruth had been here. This had been her final station. These pictures were the silent screams she had no courage left to utter aloud. Elijah backed out of the room, bile rising in his throat. He knew time was running short. If Ruth had escaped, Camila would already be calculating her next move. And if Ruth hadn't escaped ... then something unspeakable had occurred ... in Frankfurt. Reverend Claymore had kept his word. 2 officials quiet. Determined men had begun an investigation under the pretense of reviewing charity licensing. One of them had met with Elijah in secret the previous week, taking copies of the journals and a letter addressed to Bowling Green. They promised discretion. They promised justice, but bureaucracy moved slower than blood. While the system debated, Camila prepared. The next day, she hired a new girl. Her name was Clara Loudon. Just as the letter had stated ... she arrived just before dusk, escorted by emergents. Cousin from Danville, who had taken her in after her father's death. Clara was 14, thin, quiet, and grateful for the opportunity. Her hands were blistered from fieldwork. Her eyes were too tired for her age. When Camila met her at the door, she smiled wide and said, "You've come to the right place, child. You'll be safe here." Elijah watched it unfold like a terrible play. He saw Clara's small bundle of belongings placed in the room that had once belonged to Margaret. He saw Camila hand her a folded apron, instruct her on rules, schedules, expectations. He watched Clara nod with obedience and nervous gratitude. He wanted to scream, to tear the lie open in front of everyone. But he couldn't yet. That night, Elijah waited until Camila had gone to her study, where she often remained well past midnight. Then he slipped into the front parlor and penned a letter addressed directly to the authorities in Frankfurt. He included a fresh account of Ruth's disappearance, details of the second room in the cellar, and a warning another girl had arrived. This time, there may not be a second chance. He left the letter with Reverend Claymore's courier, who passed through Elkhorn Creek weekly under the pretense of delivering church supplies. By morning, the message would be in the right hands. But that night, Elijah stayed awake. He paced. He listened. He waited, and just before dawn, he heard it. A soft cry, high, thin, and terrified, rising from below the floor. He ran down the hall, past the kitchen, toward the cellar door. But when he arrived, it was locked again. The key gone. Camila had taken it. He pressed his ear to the door and heard nothing now. The silence had returned. That awful, suffocating silence. Later that day, Camila acted as if nothing had happened. She braided Clara's hair for Sunday service. She recited verses over breakfast. She smiled and spoke of blessings. But Elijah knew what was coming, and this time he wasn't going to wait. Sunday morning came cloaked in stillness. The Navarro house, usually stiff with tension, now felt eerily calm. The wind had dropped, the air hung heavy, and even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. Camila Navarro stood before the mirror in her upstairs bedroom, tightening the brooch at her collar. Her eyes studied her reflection with surgical detachment, her lips whispering morning prayer, though her thoughts lay elsewhere. Downstairs, Clara Loudon stood awkwardly in the hallway. Her dress had been ironed, her hands washed, her braids pinned neatly. She clutched a worn hymnal Camila had given her the night before, and she kept glancing at the cellar door, just once or twice, just long enough to feel the invisible pull. It seemed to emit. Elijah sat near the parlor window, watching the sky. He'd slept little, and when he did close his eyes, Ruth's face haunted him. Not screaming, not crying, just staring. Still and silent, like she was waiting for someone to finish the story for her. But the pages were still unwritten. And that terrified him most. Camila announced their departure with her usual warm authority. "Clara, fetch your shawl." "Elijah, are you ready?" "The Lord's house doesn't wait for the late." Church that day was filled with the usual congregation families from town, farmhands from the hills, a few elderly couples who came mostly out of habit. The building smelled of old pine and wax polish, and the air inside was humid with early summer heat. Camila smiled, bowed her head, and placed her hand on Clara's shoulder as they walked in, as though she were merely a benevolent guardian doing the Lord's work. But Elijah remained tense. His eyes darted between the faces in the pews and the men standing near the pulpit. Two of them were plainclothes officials from Frankfurt, disguised as visiting church trustees. Reverend Claymore had kept his promise. They had come. He approached them during the hymn break, quietly slipping a folded paper into the taller man's hand. The agent nodded once and slid it into his jacket. By the time the final benediction was spoken, the trap had already begun to close. Camila, unaware of what had been set in motion, guided Clara through the post-service mingling. She shook hands. She nodded politely. She accepted compliments with humility and quoted scripture when asked about her charitable efforts. No one, not even the elderly choir director, suspected that the woman standing among them had blood beneath her fingernails as they walked back. Toward the carriage, Elijah noticed how her stride had changed, slightly faster, slightly sharper. She had seen something, or felt something shift. Maybe it was the men in plain clothes. Maybe it was instinct. But Camila Navarro never ignored a chill in the air. She had built her life on recognizing threats before they could take shape. Back at the estate, she dismissed Clara to her room and summoned Elijah to the sitting room. There, she poured 2 cups of tea and motioned for him to sit. "I've noticed a certain restlessness in you," she said, her tone too smooth, too still. "Your spirit is heavy." He said nothing. "I understand. The world is full of temptation, of confusion. Sometimes even our own blood can lead us astray. But I want you to remember something, Elijah. This house, this mission, it exists because I chose obedience. Obedience over weakness. Obedience over chaos. And look how much good has come from it." She sipped her tea and stared at him. "I hope you've chosen obedience, too." That was the moment he knew she suspected him. Maybe. Not fully. Maybe not with proof. But she had begun to circle him now, the way a hawk eyes a wounded creature in the grass. She would wait for him to make one wrong move, then strike. That night, he stayed awake again. He knew the officials would act soon, but soon was not now. And Camila was planning something. He saw her after midnight, drifting through the hallway, in a gray nightgown, barefoot, holding a small oil lamp. She moved silently, her face blank, her eyes distant. She descended the stairs without a sound. He followed at a distance, careful not to creak the boards. She didn't go to the cellar door. Instead, she stepped into her study and closed the door behind her. Elijah pressed his ear to the wall. At first, nothing. Then rustling, papers, a drawer opening, a click, something metallic when she exited 20 minutes later. She walked past him in the shadows of the hall and didn't notice him. He returned to his room, pulse racing, and waited until the first light of dawn before returning to the study. She had taken something, the bottom drawer of her desk, once filled with ledger books and receipts, now sat nearly empty. A false bottom. Panel had been left ajar. Inside, he found a small compartment that had held a pouch now missing. Camila was preparing for escape. He rode into town just after breakfast, claiming he needed to fetch a new mechanical part from the blacksmith. Instead, he met the agents behind the general store, out of sight from the main road. "She's moving," he warned them. "She's packing something, and I don't know what she's done with Ruth." They exchanged glances, then nodded. "She makes a move, we act," one of them said. "Just keep her steady." But Elijah didn't know if he could. Back at the house, Clara seemed quieter than usual. When Elijah asked how she was, she forced a small smile, but said nothing. He could see the fear tightening behind her eyes. She had begun to understand? And Camila? Camila was radiant. She moved through the house that day with purpose, as if preparing for a guest. She polished the silver herself. She arranged flowers. In the parlor, she baked sweet cornbread and hummed an old hymn about judgment. She seemed lighter, freer, as if a plan had finally reached its climax. That night, she sent Elijah to bed early. "You look pale," she said. "The soul grows sick when it wrestles with lies. Go rest. Tomorrow, all will be right again." But Elijah didn't rest. He waited. Just past midnight, he heard the creak. The cellar door. He moved quickly but silently. Down the hall. Around the corner. And there she was, Camila Navarro, keys in hand. Descending into the darkness, he followed her to the edge of the stairs and listened. Voices. Low, panicked. Clara. Then a sharp sound, metal against skin. A cry. Then nothing. He didn't wait this time. He burst through the door and descended. And for the first time, Camila Navarro turned to face him, not as a mother, not as a widow, not as a guardian, but as what she truly was. A predator caught mid-prayer. Elijah's footsteps thundered against the cellar stairs, the lantern in his hand swinging wildly as its flame cast fractured shadows along the stone walls. Camila Navarro stood at the center of the room, framed in the amber light like a ghost caught mid-ritual. One hand gripped Clara's arm. The other held a rusted hook, old, worn, and unmistakably stained. She didn't flinch when Elijah appeared. She didn't cry out or attempt to flee. She simply turned and looked at him as if he were a boy again. Interrupting her chores. "Elijah," she said softly, "you shouldn't be here." Clara trembled beside her, wide-eyed, her lips split, a faint red welt across her cheek. She tried to pull away, but Camila tightened her grip. "Let her go," Elijah said, his voice low and steady, though he could feel his knees locking beneath him. Camila tilted her head, as if studying him for the first time. She didn't move. She didn't answer. She just stared with the patience of someone who had waited for this moment for far too long. "Elijah," she finally whispered, "do you know what you're interrupting?" He raised the lantern higher. "I know exactly what I'm interrupting." Camila's smile didn't reach her eyes. "No, you don't. You've seen things you don't understand. You've read words you've twisted with your own doubt. But this is not cruelty. This is discipline. This is love." Clara whimpered, and Camila's nails dug deeper into her arm. "I read everything," Elijah said, stepping closer. "The journals, the drawings. I've seen what you've done. I know about Elise, about Margaret, about Ruth. You called it love, but they called it pain. You think obedience is a gift, but all you gave them was fear." Camila's face shifted for the first time. Not in guilt, but in something that looked like pity. "Fear is the beginning of wisdom, Elijah. Haven't you learned anything? You've returned to a world that's unraveling. Men prey on children in alleys. Women sell their souls for bread. The church cowers beneath its own roof. The girls I brought here, they were lost, ruined, marked. I gave them order. I gave them a chance to be made whole. You murdered them," he said flatly. She laughed, a dry, cracked sound that filled the space like dust. "Oh no, the world did that long before they reached me. I only finished what was started." She turned slowly to Clara, lifting the hook. This one still fights. But she will see, eventually. They always do." Elijah didn't wait another second. He lunged forward, grabbing Camila's wrist and forcing it back. The hook clattered to the stone floor, and Clara broke free, stumbling toward the wall. Camila didn't scream. She didn't struggle. She just stared at him, calm, as though none of it surprised her. "Do it then," she said. "Strike me down, become the thing you fear." But Elijah didn't raise his hand. He turned to Clara. "Go. Run. There are men in the chapel down the road. Ask for Reverend Claymore. Go now." Clara hesitated, then ran barefoot, bruised, but alive. Camila didn't move to stop her. When they were alone, she stepped back and sat down on the stone bench, her back straight, her expression unreadable. "You're too soft," she said. "Always were. Even as a child, I could see it. You wanted kindness to fix everything. But kindness is fragile. It breaks." Elijah stared at her, the lantern flickering between them. "You broke everything you touched." "Only what was already fractured," she whispered. A creak echoed above. Footsteps, heavy ones, then voices. The cellar door opened, and the glow of fresh lanterns spilled into the chamber. 2 officials descended, followed by Reverend Claymore. Behind them, Clara stood safely out of reach, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. Camila didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched as the law approached, as the weight of justice finally stepped into her sanctuary. When they reached her, one of the men pulled out a pair of iron restraints and began to read the charges aloud: child cruelty, murder, unlawful confinement, and more. The list seemed endless, but she didn't respond. She closed her eyes, lifted her chin, and said, "The Lord will judge me, not you." They hauled her up the stairs without incident. The Navarro house was searched, the cellar photographed, the journals catalogued. Names were matched. Bodies were not recovered, only remnants. Scraps of cloth, locks of hair, tools marked by blood and corrosion. But the evidence, while grim, was overwhelming. Camila was taken to the Frankfurt detention hall. Her trial would be the most talked about case in Kentucky that decade. Elijah remained in the house for 2 more nights. He couldn't sleep. The walls still echoed. The floorboards still sighed. He found Ruth's ribbon beneath the hearth rug, torn, faded, unmistakably hers. He carried it with him when he left. The town did not mourn Camila's arrest, but they didn't celebrate either. Whispers moved through Elkhorn Creek like wind through dry grass. Some denied it outright. Others claimed she was framed. A few believed every word and feared what else might lie, buried in the quiet hills of Kentucky. What else might wear the skin of virtue? Reverend Claymore took in Clara. She was never the same. She spoke little, slept less, but she was safe now, and that mattered. Camila Navarro, however, remained unreadable. During her trial, she refused to weep or beg. She corrected the court clerk's pronunciation of her name. She asked the judge to read aloud from Deuteronomy. She described her victims as fractured vessels. The courtroom fell silent when she recited Psalm 89 from memory. And when the Monday verdict came guilty on all counts, she simply bowed her head and said, "The world will thank me, even if it doesn't know why." She was sentenced to life imprisonment. She never once asked for forgiveness. Elijah moved away after the trial. He sold the house, donated the proceeds to a home for orphaned girls in Shelbyville, and left Kentucky behind. He never returned. But the cellar remained. Years later, after the house had changed hands twice, contractors discovered bones buried beneath the second chamber. Small, fragile. Some had names scratched into the enamel of their teeth with a pin. Clara, never heard about. The discovery. Ruth was never found. And Camila Navarro? She lived out her days in silence, rarely speaking, never writing, and refusing every visitor except the prison chaplain. But even in her final moments, she held one belief close, that suffering was not evil. It was necessary. Camila Navarro's name stopped being spoken in polite circles. In the small towns that once celebrated her for her grace and charity, her name became something you didn't mention during dinner, not even in whispers. The house in Elkhorn Creek sat vacant, windows boarded, the gate sagging like it no longer had the strength to stand. Ivy crawled over the porch rails. Dust thickened on every sill. No one wanted to live there. No one dared, but even silence has a way of lingering just beneath the floorboards of memory. 3 years after Camila's sentencing, the Navarro estate was auctioned to a distant cousin from Louisville, a man who had never met her and didn't care much for small-town talk. He planned to sell off the land for development, perhaps turn the property into a tobacco warehouse, or split it into parcels. But when crews arrived to inspect the basement's foundation, they discovered something far more chilling than cracked stone, hidden behind a second false wall in the cellar. One no one had noticed during the initial investigation was a shallow chamber, Inside were the skeletal remains of 3 children, their bones arranged in a circular pattern, their hands clasped over their ribs as if in eternal prayer. No clothing remained, only fragments of ribbon and a single rusted cross nailed to the wall behind them. The county coroner was called, then the sheriff, then quietly the newspapers. And once again, Camila Navarro's name slithered out from the shadows. Reporters descended like crows. They rehashed everything her pious image, the journals, the girls, the courtroom stairs. This time, the public didn't argue. No one defended her. No one tried to paint her as misunderstood. Kentucky had seen enough. Her legend had shifted fully from scandal to horror. But in the prison at Frankfurt, Camila said nothing. The warden asked if she'd heard the news. She didn't respond. When asked if the bones belonged to Ruth, she looked at the ceiling and said, "That girl wandered too far from the fold." She never confirmed whose remains they were. She never denied anything. She simply existed, a ghost in her own body, aging quietly within the gray stone walls of her cell. Reverend Claymore, now old and hunched from years of carrying other people's pain, made the journey to see her once more. He waited 45 minutes in the visitation room before she was led in, wrists shackled, eyes dulled. She sat, folded her hands, and stared at him like he was a distant memory. He asked her why the girls? Why the pretense of love? Why the cruel discipline masquerading as grace? Camila only replied, "They weren't supposed to survive the world. I gave them something gentler than what was coming." Claymore left without saying another word. Clara Loudon, now 17, had started a new life 2 counties over. She didn't speak publicly about what had happened in the Navarro home. She worked as a seamstress in a dressmaker's shop and lived above the storefront with the shop owner and her daughter. Most days she could manage the silence. But there were nights when the air got too still, or when she caught a glimpse of someone's silhouette in a mirror and swore it looked like Camila's reflection. She never married. She never moved back. Elijah Navarro became a man of fewer words and quieter convictions. He never set foot in Elkhorn Creek again, but he carried its ghosts with him everywhere. He took up work with an educational charity in Bowling Green, helping place orphaned girls in safe homes. He read every letter from every house. He traveled unannounced to check on the girls himself. He never trusted a glowing recommendation again. He kept one of Camila's journals, just one, not as a memento, but as a reminder. It sat wrapped in brown cloth, hidden in a desk drawer. And every so often, when a new case passed through his hands, and something didn't feel quite right, he would pull it out and reread a page. Not for guidance, but to remember the language predators used when they dressed abuse in the garments of righteousness. There was one page he returned to often. It was short, just a paragraph. Love is a correction. It is not soft or indulgent. It is measured, clean, and absolute. When you bleed beneath it, it is not cruelty. It is proof that you are being shaped. He would read that line, close the book, and remind himself that some people wear devotion like armor, but they wield it like a knife. As for the house, it never became anything. The cousin from Louisville sold the land back to the county at a loss. The basement was filled in. The structure was condemned. Locals say it still stands, barely. Crooked, wind-battered, windows dark like hollow eyes. Teenagers sometimes dare each other to knock on the door or sneak inside. They say you can hear crying if you go down to the cellar. Others say you hear singing, but no one ever stays long enough to find out. Camila Navarro died in the fall of 1897. The prison chaplain found her in her bed, arms crossed, eyes closed. There was no note, no final confession. But clutched in her hands was a rosary made of black wood and faded thread. On her wrist was a faint scar, an old burn shaped like a cross. Likely self-inflicted. The state buried her in an unmarked grave on the prison grounds. No family claimed her. No stone was placed. No prayer was read. But the horror she left behind kept breathing. Kentucky newspapers printed her obituary in one paragraph. No mention of the girls. No mention of the cellar. Just a name, a date, and a single sentence. Camila Navarro, 65, formerly of Elkhorn Creek, passed away at the women's detention facility in Frankfort. No survivors are listed. But people remembered. You can't erase the kind of darkness that slips into the soil. You can't unhear the sounds that once echoed through a stone basement. And you certainly can't forget the woman who smiled while holding a hook in one hand and scripture in the other. Years had passed since the Navarro estate was emptied and sealed, but the memory of what had happened there refused to die. The town of Elkhorn Creek carried the story like a bone beneath the skin hidden, but never gone. Some whispered that the house still breathed in the night, expelling the stench of old sins through its broken chimney. Others claimed the trees around the property had begun to lean away, as though they too could no longer bear the weight of what had lived inside. But it wasn't just the ground that remembered. Deep within the Kentucky Historical Archive in Frankfort, a locked cabinet held a collection of artifacts once deemed too grotesque for public viewing. Among them were pages from Camila Navarro's journals, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, a rosary of ashwood, a rusted iron hook, and a photograph, faded and frayed, of Camila standing with a line of girls in white dresses, faces blurred. With time, eyes dark with silence, researchers studied the documents with gloves on, as if the ink itself might infect their fingers. What haunted them most wasn't the brutality, it was the conviction. Camila's writings were structured, even poetic. She spoke of morality the way a surgeon speaks of anatomy. She believed in blood as a cleanser, discipline as mercy, pain as rebirth. She called her methods a doctrine of correction. What terrified them most was that it wasn't the ravings of a madwoman. It was a belief system fully formed, chillingly logical, and cloaked in scripture. A scholar named Edith Langley, working on her dissertation at the time, spent months buried in the Navarro case. What began as academic curiosity turned into a psychological descent. She told her colleagues she could feel Camila's logic crawling through the margins, turning moral principles inside out like a glove. She abandoned the project halfway through, changed her field of study, and never returned to criminology. But others couldn't look away. True crime pamphlets emerged by the dozen, each one more sensational than the last. The Butcher of Elkhorn Creek, they called her. A widow saint, mother of thorns. The title sold copies, but none could capture the truth. Camila Navarro hadn't killed for pleasure. She hadn't killed in anger or greed. She killed because she believed she was saving souls. And that, somehow, made her far more dangerous. In the years that followed her death, survivors of her so-called sanctuary grew up and drifted into lives touched by her shadow. The few who had escaped Clara, and perhaps 2 others, seldom spoke of what they endured. Some lived quietly. Some never found peace. And one, they say, vanished without a trace. Ruth's name was etched into the unspoken history of the region. Like an open wound that refused to heal. Elijah Navarro never returned to public life. After selling the last of his property, he moved further south, taking up work as a field medic during the war. He seldom spoke of his relation to Camila. In one letter to a friend, he wrote only this: "Some people spend their lives healing. Others believe they are the scalpel." He died quietly in 1902, buried under an oak tree without fanfare or stone. The house itself remained. Piquet made it a husk, but no one had the nerve to bring it down. Local lore insisted that those who entered the cellar would hear hymns whispered through the walls. Some said you could still smell lavender in the hall, Camila's favorite oil. Children dared each other to peek through the windows. One boy claimed he saw a figure staring back a woman in black, holding a small book with bloodied corners. No. One went twice, but while Elkhorn Creek shrank into its own silence, Camila's influence seeped further. In 1911, a small church in West Tennessee was raided by local law enforcement. The congregation had been operating in secret, holding what they called correctional revivals. Inside, authorities found a series of crude journals written in a hand eerily similar to Camila's, though shakier, as if copied by someone trying to remember rather than create. The texts mirrored her language, her doctrine, even her punishments. The leader, a woman in her 40s, claimed she had once been saved by the widow Navarro herself. She was 9 years old when Clara escaped. She had survived the Navarro house. And now, 2 decades later, she was trying to recreate it. The courts acted quickly. The operation was dismantled. The woman institutionalized. But that wasn't the last. Time Camila's doctrine surfaced. Whispers of her philosophy turned up in strange places, abandoned farmhouses with marks on the walls. Sermon notes passed through prison yards, even in the margins of an unpublished religious manual seized from a radical sect in Missouri. It was never direct, never fully quoted. But the structure, the cadence, the twisted use of scripture, they echoed her voice. Even after death. It became clear that Camila Navarro hadn't just committed crimes. She'd authored a system and systems. Her harder to bury than bones. In 1927, a historian by the name of Tobias Griggs published a limited print book titled The Doctrine of Pain, The Cult of Camila Navarro. It was banned in 3 counties and denounced by several church groups for its graphic descriptions and claims that Navarro's writings had influenced at least 5 known criminal sects in the region. But the book found its way into underground academic circles, where it was dissected like forbidden scripture. Griggs made one bold argument that Camila Navarro was not simply Kentucky's first known serial killer. She was its first ideological killer, someone who didn't see her actions as crimes, but as rituals, sermons, acts of sacred destruction. The notion horrified scholars, because killers who lust for blood may eventually grow careless, but killers who believe in their purpose, they don't stop. They teach. And sometimes they're remembered as martyrs. Time, they say, is the great cleanser. It buries the worst of us beneath new stories, softens the edges of the truth, and allows memory to fade into folklore. But some stories refuse to be buried. Some roots grow deep enough to crack stone. Camila Navarro's legacy was not washed away by her death, nor erased by the crumbling of her estate. It was something more insidious, something that lingered not as memory, but as blueprint. By the early 1940s, Elkhorn Creek had changed. The town had grown smaller, tighter, like a community pulling its coat tighter in cold wind. The Navarro house still stood, although no one dared live in it. Trees had overtaken the yard, vines strangled the porch, and the cellar door had been bolted shut with rusted chains. Some called it haunted. Others said it was cursed. But mostly it was ignored, because that was easier than remembering what had happened there. In 1943, a team of graduate students from Lexington arrived with permission to study the house as part of a folklore research project. Led by a professor of Appalachian Studies, the group was instructed to document the oral history of the Navarro case. They were skeptics mostly, young minds full of ambition and arrogance, sure that the stories were just exaggerated fragments of rural imagination. They brought tape recorders, notebooks, and flashbulb cameras. They interviewed townsfolk. They walked the halls of the Navarro estate. And eventually, on the 3rd night, they pried open the cellar door. What they found wasn't just decay. It was precision, even in rot. The architecture of Camila's obsession remained. Wooden pegs hammered into the stone wall in perfect intervals. A line of faint scratches on the floor, just deep enough to be read in the right light. One student swore she saw numbers carved beneath the table where the journals were said to have been written. Another claimed he heard someone humming a hymn. Behind him, though no one else had been in the room, the group left early. The report was never completed. One of the students, decades later, recounted the visit in a personal memoir. She wrote, "It wasn't the cellar that frightened me. It was the thought that she had lived there every day, believing what she was. Doing was holy. That kind of certainty it echoes." In the decades that followed, Camila Navarro's name became a curiosity in academic circles. Her case was studied in criminology departments. Her journals, partially transcribed and locked in restricted university archives, were occasionally referenced in theses about moral dissonance and religious extremism. But in Kentucky, her name was still met with silence. It wasn't denial. It was survival. The truth was, people hadn't forgotten. They had just learned not to say her name out loud. In 1971, an independent journalist published a long-form expose titled "The Widow's Doctrine," retracing Camila's crimes, the trial, and the buried influence she'd left behind. The piece was raw, honest, and deeply unsettling. It forced a new generation to ask old questions. How did a woman like Camila exist unnoticed for so long? How many lives had her warped beliefs touched beyond Elkhorn Creek? And most disturbingly, could someone like her exist again? The article reignited public interest. New theories emerged. Some speculated that Camila had not acted alone, that there were others involved in her discipline rituals, perhaps elders in the town or religious leaders who chose silence over scandal. Others believed her teachings had inspired a small but secretive following, one that still passed her doctrines down in whispers, in isolated cabins, or within strict sects that twisted faith into fear. No definitive proof ever surfaced. But then, again, there hadn't been much proof in the beginning either, only bones, silence, and eyes that had seen too much. By the 1990s, the Navarro case was featured in a documentary series on historical female criminals. The narrator's voice carried a mix of disbelief and reverence, calling Camila an architect of darkness. The show revived public fascination briefly, leading to the first formal request for her journals to be published in full. The request was denied. Too dangerous, the university claimed. Too easily misinterpreted, but portions leaked anyway. A photocopied page here, a retyped paragraph there. On one fragment, Camila had written, "Correction without consent is not cruelty, it is covenant. The soul does not know what it needs. It must be told. And if it screams, it is only the sound of decay leaving the body." That sentence was later found scribbled on the wall of a group home in Indiana, just above a locked closet filled with restraints. History does not always repeat itself, but it does leave breadcrumbs. And Camila Navarro's trail was made of them. In 2007, the Navarro house was finally demolished. It took nearly 2 weeks, as much of the structure resisted the machinery brought to tear it down. Mold had hollowed the beams. The basement had flooded and hardened into sludge. But when the final wall fell, workers reported a strange odor like lavender, sharp and sudden, as if someone had just stepped out of the room. No remains were found that day. But beneath the floorboards of the old study, they uncovered a sealed tin box containing a final journal. The ink had faded. The paper crumbled at the corners. But the writing was unmistakably hers. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an apology. It was a blueprint. Instructions. Beliefs. A roadmap for how to build a sanctuary. How to recruit the broken. How to make them believe the pain was holy. The Journal was taken into custody by the state. It has never been released. And yet, pieces of it keep surfacing. Camila Navarro never set out to become a legend. She set out to mold human souls the way others mold clay, through fire, through pressure, through the removal of all that was considered weak. And in doing so, she became something far worse than a killer. She became a scripture, a living doctrine. And long after her body returned to dust, the shape of her ideas remained intact, past in whispers, carried in the hands of those looking. For control dressed as salvation. So when you hear stories of women who heal with punishment, or communities where obedience is called devotion, listen closely. Not all monsters leave claw marks. Some leave instructions.